The story of the Knights Templar has become a legend. They were known as a holy order. Some would even say God's personal militia. A society so powerful, so secretive, that its true purpose is debated to this day. They were first glorified, but then accused of blasphemy, wickedness, and devil worship. They would rise to such powerful heights that their eventual fall was inevitable. Few groups in history have accumulated so much power, risen so quickly, or fallen so far. Their saga is, without doubt, the most mysterious of all the stories born from the Crusades. Just who were these men? Heretics? A brotherhood of treasure hunters? Or, as some theorists suggest, the keepers of sacred knowledge that could shake the very foundations of Christianity itself? The knights themselves left many clues, hidden in ancient manuscripts and scratched into the stone walls of their prisons, secrets waiting to be deciphered by those adept enough to crack the Templar code. This story begins in the context of war, the 2 centuries of bloodshed that the Christian West called the Crusades, or the Wars of the Cross. For 200 years, blood was spilled in the name of God. Lines were drawn, alliances were formed, and enemies were made that endure to this day. Out of the destruction came legends of heroes, martyrs, and sacred relics, but of all the stories, the most enduring is the saga of the Knights Templar. To understand them, we must first understand the Crusades, which did not emerge from a vacuum. They were the culmination of centuries of conflict, theological development, and shifting power dynamics that had been building across the Mediterranean world long before Pope Urban II ever spoke the words that set the Templars in motion in 1095. Long before this, for hundreds of years, Christian and Muslim civilizations had existed in a state of perpetual tension. This was not a new phenomenon born in the 11th century. It had been simmering since the Islamic conquest of the Levant and North Africa in the 7th century, when vast Christian territories suddenly fell under Muslim rule. For 4 centuries, Christian kingdoms watched their southern and eastern borders, acutely aware that the world they knew was fundamentally divided between cross and crescent. In Spain, this tension had crystallized into something far more organized and persistent than mere border skirmishes. The Reconquista, the centuries-long Christian effort to reclaim the Iberian Peninsula from Muslim rule, had created a culture of holy warfare that was uniquely European. For generations, Spanish Christian kingdoms had waged systematic military campaigns against Muslim Al-Andalus, driven by a fusion of religious conviction and territorial ambition. These were not quick raids or defensive actions. They were prolonged military campaigns framed explicitly as wars of faith, as efforts to restore Christian lands to Christian rule. The Reconquista demonstrated something radical, that Christian society could organize itself militarily around religious purpose, that warfare itself could be sanctified, and that entire kingdoms could devote themselves to a crusade without waiting for papal authorization. This had fundamentally altered how Christians thought about warfare. Medieval Christianity had long struggled with the question of violence. Could a Christian, a follower of the peace-loving Christ, justify killing? The answer that emerged was sophisticated. Yes, if the cause was just. Yes, if defending Christendom or spreading the faith. The warriors of the Reconquista embodied this new theology. They were not mercenaries or common soldiers. They saw themselves as instruments of God's will, fighting to restore Christian order to lands that had been stolen by Islam. The Church supported them, blessed them, and increasingly sanctified their violence. This theology of holy war did not originate in Spain, but Spain perfected it. By the 11th century, the Spanish kingdoms had proven that Christian societies could sustain prolonged military campaigns against Islamic powers, that they could maintain religious motivation across generations, and that the Church could sanction and encourage such warfare without contradiction. In doing so, they had created a template. They had shown what was possible. Meanwhile, in Rome itself, the Church was undergoing a profound transformation. The Cluniac reform movement had swept through monasteries across Europe, reimposing discipline, standardizing practices, and most crucially, reasserting papal authority over the religious landscape. The Pope was no longer merely a bishop of Rome. He was becoming a supreme authority, a figure capable of commanding obedience from kings and peasants alike. This centralization of power meant that the Pope could now conceive of projects on a scale previously unimaginable. He could call upon Christendom as a unified force. At the same time, a new warrior class was consolidating its power across Europe. Feudalism had created a culture of military nobility, men trained from childhood in combat, bound by oaths of loyalty, and hungry for glory, wealth, and land. These feudal lords had no unified purpose. They fought each other constantly in petty conflicts that devastated the European countryside. The Church had tried to constrain this violence through the peace of God and the truce of God, theological and legal mechanisms designed to limit warfare and protect the innocent. But these had only partially succeeded. What if, instead of limiting this warrior energy, the Church could redirect it? What if feudal lords, with all their martial skill and ambition, could be pointed toward a single enemy? What if their lust for conquest could be sanctified and organized on behalf of Christendom itself? This was a revolutionary thought, but the groundwork for it was already being laid. Chivalry, the idealized code of knighthood, was becoming more formalized in the 11th century. Knights were increasingly viewed not merely as warriors, but as defenders of the faith, protectors of the Church, champions of righteousness. The notion that a knight's highest calling was to serve God, not merely his feudal lord, was taking root in the consciousness of European nobility. Pilgrimage was becoming fashionable among the warrior class. Journeys to Jerusalem or Rome or Santiago de Compostela were increasingly undertaken by knights as acts of piety. Some fought their way there, battling through hostile territory, seeing themselves as engaged in righteous combat even as they travelled to holy sites. And then there were the reports. Pilgrims returning from the Holy Land brought tales, some exaggerated, some not, of Christian persecution under Muslim rule. They spoke of restrictions on pilgrimage, of desecrated churches, of Christian communities suffering under Islamic governance. Whether or not these accounts were entirely accurate, they resonated powerfully in the Christian imagination. The Holy Land, the birthplace of Christ himself, was in the hands of infidels. This was not merely a political problem or a military question. It was a profound spiritual wound. The most sacred sites of Christianity were controlled by non-believers. In the East, the Byzantine Empire, the last great Christian power in the Mediterranean, was crumbling. It had been losing territory to the Seljuk Turks for decades. In 1071, at the Battle of Manzikert, the Byzantines suffered a catastrophic defeat. The Seljuks poured into Anatolia, one of the empire's most important provinces. The Byzantine emperor, facing the real possibility that his entire civilization might be conquered, began sending desperate pleas to the West for military aid. For the first time, Eastern Christianity was explicitly asking Western Christianity for help in a military capacity. This was significant. It created a sense of common Christian purpose across the Mediterranean divide, a feeling that Christianity as a whole was under threat from Islamic expansion. The Islamic world itself was fragmented in a way that had not been true for centuries. Once unified under the Abbasid Caliphate, it had splintered into competing dynasties, regional powers, and fractious kingdoms. This fragmentation meant that Islamic resistance to a Western invasion would not be unified or coordinated. The Islamic world was not a monolith preparing for Christian assault. It was divided, sometimes warring against itself, vulnerable in ways it had not been during periods of greater unity. All of these currents, the Spanish precedent of holy war, the centralization of papal power, the restless ambition of the feudal warrior class, the ideology of chivalry, the mythology of pilgrimage, the reports of persecution, the collapse of Byzantine power, and the fragmentation of the Islamic world, were flowing together by the 1090s. The intellectual, theological, political, and military conditions had aligned in a unique historical moment. Something was building. The world was ready for the Pope to make a call, ready for Christendom to unite around a single purpose, ready for holy war on a scale never before attempted. The papacy itself was at a pinnacle of power and ambition that had never been reached before. For decades, papal reformers had been working to assert the independence and supremacy of the Church over secular rulers. The conflict between Pope and Emperor had come to symbolize this struggle. Popes were no longer merely religious figures, they were political actors of the first magnitude, commanding armies, dispensing lands and wielding excommunication as a weapon of statecraft. By the 1090s, under Pope Gregory VII and his successors, the papacy had achieved a level of moral authority and institutional power that made it possible to conceive of a project of unprecedented scope. The Pope could speak, and millions would listen. The Pope could call, and kingdoms would respond. But there was also desperation in this ambition. The Church was facing an internal crisis of legitimacy. Simony, the buying and selling of church offices, had corrupted the clergy. Priests kept concubines. Bishops acted like feudal lords more concerned with territory than with souls. The laity were increasingly disillusioned. Heretical movements were spreading, offering alternative visions of Christian purity that the official Church seemed unable to provide. What the Church needed was a grand project, something that would reunite Christendom around a shared purpose, something that would demonstrate the moral authority of the papacy, something that would channel the pious impulses of millions into service of the Church's vision. A great crusade, sanctioned by the Pope, blessed by heaven, promising salvation itself, could do all of this. There was also economic incentive beneath the surface. The Italian merchant republics, Venice, Genoa, and others, had been expanding their trading networks throughout the Mediterranean. They had commercial interests in the Levant and the Holy Land. Control of Mediterranean trade routes meant wealth and power. A crusade that brought the Holy Land under Christian control would also bring those trade routes under Christian and potentially Italian dominance. The great merchant families saw opportunity in a crusade. They could profit from it, expanding their commercial networks, establishing trading posts and colonies in conquered territories. And there was the matter of eschatology, the obsession with the end times. As the year 1000 had approached, many Christians had believed the world might end. When it didn't, a certain anxiety persisted. The approach of the 1090s, coupled with astronomical phenomena and a general sense that history was reaching some kind of climax, fed apocalyptic expectations. Some believed that the liberation of Jerusalem was a necessary precondition for the second coming of Christ. Others saw the advance of Islam as a sign of the end times. The crusade, in this framework, was not merely a military campaign. It was a cosmological event, part of God's plan for the final days of history. This theological urgency gave the crusade a weight and significance that transcended ordinary warfare. Environmental factors played their part as well. The 11th century had seen an agricultural revolution, improvements in farming technology, clearing of forests, and expansion of arable land had led to population growth. Europe was becoming crowded. Younger sons of nobility, who would not inherit their father's lands, had limited options. A crusade offered them opportunity, the possibility of carving out new territories, establishing new fiefdoms, accumulating wealth and power in distant lands. For the landless and ambitious, the Holy Land represented a frontier, a new world of possibilities. In 1095, Pope Urban II issued the call for a general passage, urging Christians to reclaim the Holy Land. The Pope offered an extraordinary incentive, an indulgence, a spiritual, get-out-of-jail-free card that promised salvation, even for the most grievous crimes. Simply reaching Jerusalem, the Pope promised, would absolve a crusader. This call extended far beyond professional soldiers. It was an appeal to every Christian, including the common riffraff. In fact, many of the first crusaders were criminals, thieves, murderers, and even rapists, who sought to wipe their slate clean. One famous account of the Pope's speech even called for, "Let those who have been robbers now become knights." Out of the chaos and bloodshed that followed the capture of Jerusalem in 1099, a new necessity arose. The roads connecting the coast to the Holy City were a dangerous wilderness, and Christian pilgrims were easy prey for bandits and predators. In this lawless territory, around the year 1119, an order was formed to protect them. The founder was Hugues de Payan, a wealthy French nobleman and veteran of the First Crusade. He and 9 other knights, all veterans, wealthy men and related by blood or marriage, stepped forward. Their mission was simple and humble, to protect these streams of defenseless Christian travellers on the treacherous roads. The very existence of this group was a profound and dangerous paradox. They were professional soldiers, yet they chose to live as monks. This blending of the spiritual path and military might was absolutely unprecedented. They were meant to be humble servants in the hands of their vengeful god, yet they were committed to fighting until death. This notion of a military monk was a revolutionary concept in the medieval world. The men who joined the order had to relinquish everything. To dedicate his life fully, a knight had to give up his family name, his lands, his riches, and all worldly pleasures. He was no longer his own man. The knights swore the 3 traditional monastic vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. They were required to live a life that was holy and humble. This dedication to austerity is why their official name was the Order of Poor Knights of the Temple of Solomon. Their famous seal, which became the enduring image of the early order, depicted 2 knights riding 1 horse. This was a powerful symbol of their initial poverty and self-denial. They would share their food bowl with a brother knight and wear nothing ostentatious. They were expected to live this life of strict dedication. This rigid humility and devotion was prescribed in the rule book that governed their existence, the Latin Rule. It was a complete guide to a new life, governing everything from how much time to dedicate to prayer and sleep, to specific instructions on military protocols, such as how to mount a horse and how to keep the military line straight. The Knights Templar were doubly armed. Their soul was protected by the armour of faith, just as their body was protected by armour of steel. They were fighting for the name of God, with their strength and with their faith. They were truly monks on horseback and warriors at the same time. When we look at the history of the medieval knight, we are talking about a very large timeline. The image of the shining suit of plate armour belongs to the late Middle Ages, the 15th and 16th centuries. Plate armour could appear very beautiful, shining under the sun, and the knights who wore it would fight for honour, riches, love, or sport. But the original Templars were in chainmail. They were stripped down, low-tech, and not interested in showing off. The Knights Templar were strictly God's warriors, forged out of the earliest, bloodiest phase of the Crusades. A young French nobleman, such as Geoffroy de Champagne, would have had his life completely transformed. His was the warrior's way. For such a young man in the 13th century, these causes were all the meaning he needed. Although Geoffroy's deeds may never have made it to the history books, his courage, and the courage of his fellow Templars, defined their existence. These 10 humble protectors were given quarters on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, the site built upon the ruins of the original Temple of Solomon. What started as a simple mission of defense would soon be transformed by the secrets that lay beneath that sacred site. That transformation would lead to an unprecedented accumulation of wealth and power that would make them not just God's soldiers, but the treasurers of kings. The year is 1119. 10 humble knights, dedicated to poverty and protection, have just founded their order. This order, the Poor Knights of the Temple of Solomon, immediately received an extraordinary defining privilege. King Baldwin II of Jerusalem, recognizing their commitment, granted them a specific piece of real estate, a wing of his own royal palace built upon the ruins of the most sacred site in the Christian, Jewish, and Muslim worlds, the Temple Mount. Their headquarters were established on the southeastern platform of the mount, directly over the ruins of the original Temple of Solomon. This was the very place where, according to biblical accounts, the Ark of the Covenant once rested. It was a location infused with immense spiritual power and history, but a profound question immediately arises. Why? Why would 10 seemingly low-priority knights, men dedicated merely to guarding roads, be given access to the most contested and sacred real estate in the Holy Land? The official story states they were simply there for lodging and logistical support. Yet, for nearly a decade, the knights essentially disappeared from the scene. They remained in Jerusalem for 8 or 9 years, and then, without any clear explanation, they abruptly vanished, scurrying back to Europe at considerable speed. This period, the missing years, has fueled centuries of theories. The accepted narrative that 10 rather elderly, middle-aged knights were busy protecting all the pilgrims travelling from the coast simply does not hold up to scrutiny. They must have been doing something else, the theory goes. They chose the Temple Mount for a specific reason, and that reason was almost certainly not security. The prevailing theory suggests the Knights Templar were not security guards, but archaeologists. They were digging. Their headquarters lay over a labyrinth of tunnels and underground chambers extending beneath the Temple Mount. These tunnels were ancient, part of the foundations of the Herodian temple complex. We know they were there because subsequent excavations confirmed it. For instance, in 1867, a British survey team uncovered Templar artefacts, spurs, armaments and pottery, scattered throughout the tunnels. The evidence suggested a significant long-term occupation of the space beneath the temple. So, what were they looking for? The belief is that they were searching for the immense treasure and relics left behind by the Jewish people after the Roman invasion of 70 AD. This was rumoured to include a vast hoard of gold, silver and priceless scrolls of immense historical significance. The value of this find would have been incalculable, enough to finance a kingdom, but beyond gold and silver, the stories quickly turned to the legendary, the divine. They were supposedly searching for the lost Ark of the Covenant, the chest that held the 10 Commandments. They may have been searching for pieces of the true cross, the very wood upon which Christ was crucified. Most famously, they are linked to the quest for the Holy Grail. The Grail itself is an enigma. Was it the chalice used by Christ at the Last Supper? Was it a vial containing precious holy blood? Or was the Grail something entirely different? A secret book, a scroll, or a body of sacred knowledge that could shake the foundations of Catholic orthodoxy? Books like the Da Vinci Code have popularized the controversial idea that the Grail was the holy bloodline of Jesus and Mary Magdalene. While such concepts are controversial, they point to the underlying fear that the Templars may have found an explosive religious secret. The fact remains that when the 9 founding knights finished their mysterious excavations, they returned to Europe in 1128 and instantly became very powerful and very rich in a very short space of time. Their newfound wealth and influence were sudden, vast, and wholly unexplained by their humble founding mission. The speed of their legitimization was equally staggering. Back in Europe, the Templars found a powerful ally, Saint Bernard of Clairvaux. Bernard, a leading theologian and an immensely influential figure, whose nephew was one of the 9 founding knights, took up their cause. He wrote the famous tract, A New Knighthood, in which he sang their praises and gave the order spiritual sanction. Bernard argued that the Templar was a new kind of warrior, truly a fearless knight, protected by the armour of faith and fearing neither demons nor men. This spiritual endorsement was critical. Thanks to Bernard's influence, the Templars were officially sanctioned by the Pope and granted the Latin rule. They were now an official, legitimate body under the Catholic Church. But the most consequential result of their return was the extraordinary set of perks and privileges they received, seemingly as payment for their service. They were granted complete autonomy, answerable to no one's authority except the Pope himself. Crucially, they were exempt from taxes. This gave them an immense financial advantage over every other military and political force in the Holy Land. Some historians see these privileges as a simple reward for their piety and commitment to protecting pilgrims. Others view it as a massive payoff, a form of hush money granted by the Church to prevent information about extraordinary, potentially heretical relics or scrolls from ever getting out. Whatever the reason, the Templars launched one of the most successful fundraising and recruiting campaigns in history. Noble families, eager for a share in the spiritual merit, or perhaps hoping to secure an alliance with their burgeoning power, flocked to the order, dedicating their sons, their lands, and their fortunes to the cause. The Templars were no longer 10 poor knights. They were quickly on their way to becoming the richest, most influential, and most feared military financial power the medieval world had ever known. Fast forward to the year 1128. The 10 founding knights have returned from Jerusalem after 9 years of unconfirmed activities on the Temple Mount. They did not return poor or even slightly richer. They returned as an emerging power with a purpose, a plan, and an air of immense spiritual and material authority. The transformation from a small band of humble protectors to an overwhelming financial and military force was instantaneous and profound. This radical shift in their status was made possible by Saint Bernard of Clairvaux. His influence was unparalleled. He was the spiritual conscience of Europe. Crucially, his nephew, André de Montbard, was one of the 9 original Templar knights. Bernard took up their cause, lending the full weight of his colossal authority to this new, paradoxical concept, the warrior monk. Bernard wrote the famous tract, A New Knighthood, specifically to sing the praises of the Templars and justify their existence. He argued that the Templar was a new kind of warrior, truly a fearless knight, protected by the armour of faith, just as his body was protected by armour of steel. He claimed that because they fought for a spiritual ideal and not for worldly glory, the Templar feared neither demons nor men. This spiritual endorsement was not just a seal of approval, it was the engine that launched the Templars into the stratosphere of European power politics. Thanks entirely to Bernard's political and religious manoeuvring, the Pope formally sanctioned the order. The Templars were granted the final version of the Latin rule, solidifying their identity. But the most consequential result was the extraordinary set of perks and privileges they received, perks that fundamentally changed their relationship with the secular world and made them an economic juggernaut. First, they were granted complete autonomy, answerable to no one's authority except the Pope himself. This placed them above all local kings, bishops, and feudal lords across Europe. They were an entity unto themselves, free to travel, raise money, and operate without internal interference, an untouchable entity within any kingdom they inhabited. Second, and most critically, they were made exempt from all taxes. They did not have to pay tithes to the church, nor tolls to local nobles, nor any royal taxes on their vast landholdings. This meant that every single donation and every business transaction instantly generated massive tax-free profits, giving them an insurmountable financial advantage over every other military and political force in the Holy Land and Europe. Some historians see these unparalleled privileges as a simple reward for their piety and dedication. Others, however, view it as something more transactional, a massive payoff, a form of hush money granted by the Church to prevent information about extraordinary relics or scrolls, perhaps one that challenged the very foundations of Catholic orthodoxy from ever getting out. The suddenness and sheer scope of their legal and financial freedom suggest the reward was for more than simply guarding roads. Whatever the reason, the Templars launched one of the most successful fundraising and recruiting campaigns in history. Noble families, eager for a share in the spiritual merit or perhaps hoping to secure a valuable alliance with their burgeoning power, flocked to the order. They donated their sons, their land deeds, and their fortunes to the cause. The Templars quickly acquired vast tracts of land across Europe, from England to Spain, turning their religious fervour into the largest real estate portfolio on the continent. They established commandery houses, known simply as temples, that dotted the map in every major urban centre and alongside every major road. These temples served not just as military garrisons and recruiting hubs, but as the foundation for their next and arguably most important innovation. The Templars were no longer just military masters, they became the financial masters of the medieval world. Their single greatest contribution was not a military tactic, but an ingenious proto-banking system that revolutionized medieval travel and commerce. Before the Templars, a pilgrim or merchant traveling to the Holy Land had to carry their entire fortune with them in the form of gold, silver, or jewels. This made them prime targets for bandits and thieves. The Templars eliminated this risk entirely. A pilgrim would visit a Templar commandery, perhaps the Temple Church in London or Paris, and deposit their valuables and land deeds. In return, they received a special note written in cipher, a cryptic, coded ticket or document. This note acted exactly like a modern-day traveller's cheque or a charge card. When the pilgrim needed to pay for supplies or lodging along their route, they would present this coded chit to the local Templar house in France, Italy, or the Holy Land. That local temple, accessing the order's shared global ledger, would pay the necessary money for them, recode the chit to reflect the new balance, and the pilgrim would carry on. The system was so safe and reliable that even kings used it to move vast quantities of money across hostile territories without fear of interception. The Templars had invented a secure form of fractional reserve banking and international wire transfer. This was American Express writ large, 7 centuries before the invention of the actual credit card. This system was brilliant and made the Templars indispensable. They became the treasurers of kings. They managed the royal treasuries of France and England, financed massive construction projects like cathedrals, and backed entire wars. They accumulated riches beyond imagination and used their tax-exempt status and massive infrastructure to become the primary financial engine of the Crusader states. The Templars had become the ultimate power brokers, controlling both the flow of money and the flow of arms. Their vast network of temples functioned as a sophisticated, efficient international banking system, protecting wealth, securing loans, and facilitating trade with speed and safety previously unimaginable. They were a military organization powered by an economic empire. This unprecedented wealth and power, born from a secret mission and secured by papal privilege, would guarantee their dominance for the next 150 years. But it was this very wealth and privilege that would ultimately lead to their violent, sudden demise. The power they accumulated made them too big to fail and too dangerous to live. By the mid-12th century, the Knights Templar had become masters of 2 worlds, the financial houses of Europe and the bloody battlefields of the Holy Land. To finance their wars, they were the ultimate bankers, but on the field of combat, they were strictly God's warriors, utterly dedicated to their sacred vows and defined by a willingness to die for their cause. Their immense effectiveness as soldiers stemmed directly from their monastic discipline. Every aspect of a Templar knight's existence was dictated by the Latin rule, a spiritual guide that was also the most complete and rigorous military code of its time. This rulebook covered everything from the spiritual, how much time to dedicate to prayer, to the practical, how much sleep was allowed, the type of food they could eat, and even the length of a brother's hair. Their existence was meant to be one of simplicity, dedication, and constant preparation, ensuring that their minds and bodies were always prepared for the ultimate sacrifice. They were soldiers living as monks, committed to a life of strict adherence to the rule. The very look of a Templar spoke of their unique status. They wore simple, functional chainmail armor, a style that predated the heavy, impractical plate armor favored by later, more flamboyant knights. These original warriors were stripped down, low-tech, and focused only on efficiency, survival, and victory in the name of God. Over their armor, they wore the iconic white mantle emblazoned with the Red Cross. This was not merely a uniform, it was a visible, solemn sign of their commitment to martyrdom. To die while wearing that mantle was the ultimate assurance of securing a place in heaven. Their military might rested on 2 unbreakable pillars: their absolute devotion and their specialized military equipment. Central to their physical power was the heavy warhorse, or destrier. These magnificent animals were specially bred, highly conditioned, and trained to withstand the terror and noise of battle, the screams, the steel, and the blood. When a full squadron of Templars mounted these powerful destriers and formed their ranks, they became the ultimate weapon of the medieval age, capable of smashing through any line of infantry. Their primary offensive tactic was devastatingly simple and rarely matched: the heavy cavalry charge. The Templars favoured forming a massive kinetic assault force, often utilising the wedge formation. In this terrifying manoeuvre, the Grand Master or a senior commander would lead the point, creating a focused spear of armour and horseflesh designed to pierce the enemy's line with maximum concentrated impact. Once the wedge broke through, the entire enemy formation would collapse into chaos, panic, and slaughter. No force in the Middle East, not even the disciplined armies of Saladin, could reliably withstand a full, committed Templar charge, which they delivered with the force of a battering ram powered by faith. This incredible military prowess was reinforced by a code of honour, so severe it dictated that retreat was strictly forbidden. A Templar knight was not allowed to turn and run unless the odds against him were absolutely overwhelming. The rules specified a ratio of at least 3-1, and even then, he required the explicit, spoken permission of his commanding officer. Without that direct order, they were bound to fight to the last man. This commitment to fight until death was not simply spiritual, it was deeply tactical. The sight of the Templars refusing to break ranks, standing their ground, and often successfully routing a much larger enemy force, created a psychological fear that extended far beyond their actual numbers. Their fierce courage and the courage of their fellow Templars saved thousands of lives across the decades of the Crusades, cementing their legend as the elite, unshakable fighting force. Their organization on the battlefield was as meticulous as their discipline in the monastery. The Latin rule governed everything, dictating everything from how to mount a horse and how to keep the line straight to the specific roles within a squadron. Each Templar knight was an elite officer, supported by a dedicated handful of squires, servants, and Turkish mercenaries, who were expert archers, ensuring that weapons were maintained and logistics were seamless. This professionalism made them the gold standard for all other Crusader armies. While other armies were temporary collections of feudal levies, the Templars were a professional, standing army, always ready to fight, trained and provisioned for rapid, brutal deployment. They were experts in both the slow, grinding reality of siege warfare, commanding vast stone fortresses like the famed Chastel-Pèlerin, and rapid response heavy cavalry deployment in the field. To fully understand this devotion, we must look at the lives of the men themselves. A young nobleman like Geoffroy de Champagne of France would have embodied this transformation. He surrendered his family name, his identity, and his entire future to become a monk on horseback. For such a young man in the 13th century, these causes, serving God with his strength and with his faith, were all the meaning he needed. Although Geoffroy's deeds may never have made it into the mainstream history books, his discipline and sacrifice were the bricks that built the formidable military reputation of the entire order. The Templars were doubly armed. Their soul was protected by the armour of faith, just as their body was protected by armour of steel. They were fighting for the name of God, with their strength and with their faith. This absolute, unbending commitment, however, had a tragic flaw. The Templars were so inflexible, so incapable of retreat, that a tactical blunder in the field often became a catastrophic massacre. Their dedication made them legendary heroes, but their unbreakable code allowed no room for strategic flexibility. They would soon learn that sometimes fighting to the last man meant losing the war, and their military dominance, having reached its peak, would quickly give way to catastrophe. The military might and financial wealth of the Templars guaranteed their dominance in the Holy Land for over a century. They were the shock troops of the Crusader states, responsible for the construction and defence of massive stone fortresses, castles like Chastel-Pèlerin, a formidable fortress built directly into the sea which epitomised their power and resilience. They were a permanent, professional force, ready to fight for the name of God at a moment's notice, sustained by the endless tax-exempt wealth flowing from their European commanderies. The greatest challenge to their dominance, and the ultimate measure of their military legend, came in the form of Saladin, the Muslim Sultan of Egypt and Syria. Saladin was a brilliant military strategist and a deeply respected adversary who successfully united the Muslim factions against the fragmented Crusader kingdoms. The Templars and Saladin were locked in a century-long struggle, creating an atmosphere of mutual respect and intense fear that was unique in the history of the Crusades. They understood that the Templars, unlike other knights, could not be bought, could not be ransomed, and would not retreat. The Templars' military fame reached its zenith at the Battle of Montgisard in 1177. Saladin, confident in his superior numbers, had marched an enormous army, estimated at over 26,000 men, deep into the Kingdom of Jerusalem. The young King Baldwin IV, known as the Leper King, commanded a vastly smaller Crusader force, numbering perhaps only 5,000, which included only a few hundred Templar knights. This was an overwhelming 5-to-1 disadvantage in the heart of their kingdom. The Templar Grand Master, Odo de Saint-Amand, refused to concede defeat. He led the Templar contingent, utilizing their disciplined heavy cavalry to deliver a devastating surprise attack. They had been allowed to charge the battlefield, utilizing their speed and armor to strike at the supply lines of the disorganized Muslim army. The power of the wedge formation, delivered with the full weight of the massive destriers and the armor of the knights, was focused and relentless, shattering Saladin's centre. The charge was so fierce, so well executed and so unexpected that it sent the Sultan's army into a frantic, chaotic rout. Saladin himself barely escaped capture, fleeing the battlefield on a racing camel. Montgisard was a stunning tactical victory that cemented the Templars' reputation across Europe as superhuman warriors, incapable of defeat. The power of faith and steel had seemingly conquered all odds, but the unbending code of the Templars, which guaranteed their triumphs, also contained the seeds of their destruction. Their absolute refusal to retreat, while often heroic and necessary for the morale of the Crusader states, allowed no room for the strategic flexibility necessary to survive the brutal realities of the Desert War. Their dedication allowed for no tactical withdrawal, only glorious victory or holy martyrdom. That tragedy came a decade later at the Battle of the Horns of Hattin in 1187. This time, Saladin had his vengeance. The Crusaders were commanded by a deeply flawed and ambitious leader, Grand Master Gerard de Ridefort. De Ridefort, against the clear advice of more cautious military leaders, insisted on marching the army across a vast, waterless and scorching desert plain in July to relieve the besieged city of Tiberias. This strategic blunder sealed their fate. Under the merciless summer sun, the Crusader army was dehydrated, exhausted, and demoralized before the first arrow was even fired. Saladin's forces expertly trapped them near two extinct volcanic peaks known as the Horns of Hattin. What followed was a massacre. The Templars, true to their code, dismounted and fought to the last man, their courage and desperation legendary. But even their armour of faith could not overcome thirst, heat, exhaustion, and overwhelming numbers. The sight of these fearsome monks dying in the dry dust became a symbol of the war's ultimate failure. Hattin was a total and absolute military catastrophe. The Crusader army was annihilated, and the true cross, which had been carried into battle, was captured, a spiritual blow that devastated the West. Saladin took King Guy of Lusignan prisoner. Recognizing that the Templars' devotion made them too dangerous to ransom or keep alive, Saladin specifically ordered the execution of almost every captured Templar and Hospitaller knight on the field. The execution of these holy warriors was seen across Europe as the ultimate outrage and a sign that the Christian project in the East was failing. The disaster at Hattin sealed the fate of the Holy Land. Within months, Saladin recaptured Jerusalem. Despite several subsequent crusades, the Christian position was permanently weakened. For the next century, the Crusaders fought a grinding, desperate defensive war, sustained only by the financial lifeline and military discipline provided by the Templars. But their mission, to hold the Holy Land, was irreversibly failing. The final blow came in 1291 with the fall of Acre. Acre was the last major Crusader city, a chaotic walled seaport that served as the final sanctuary. The Templars, defending their massive seaside fortress, fought with the fury of desperation against the Mamluk armies. When the walls finally crumbled, the surviving knights were offered safe passage, but they refused to surrender their commandery. They fought on until the foundations of their fortress themselves collapsed into the sea, burying the last Templar defenders. The fall of Acre marked the official and irreversible end of the Crusades in the Holy Land. The order had lost its original, sacred purpose, retreating first to the island of Cyprus, and then moving their massive financial and administrative headquarters to Paris, France. Now back in Europe, their vast liquid wealth, their standing army, and their complete immunity from local law, answerable only to the Pope, no longer made them heroes. In the eyes of indebted monarchs and jealous rivals, the Templars were no longer God's warriors. They were an immense, dangerous, and expendable financial threat. The stage was set for their final, shocking betrayal. The walls of Acre have fallen, and the Crusades in the Holy Land are utterly and irrevocably over. The Knights Templar, having lost their original sacred purpose, were forced to retreat. Their massive financial and military headquarters were quickly consolidated in Paris, France. They were no longer the indispensable heroes of the East, but the richest, most powerful, and most secretive organization in the West, possessing vast tracts of land and an ocean of liquid capital. Their very success was their undoing. The political landscape was changing, and there was no longer any need for a permanent tax-exempt standing army that answered only to the Pope. The man who orchestrated their downfall was King Philip IV of France, known to history as Philip the Fair. Philip was a ruthless, ambitious monarch desperate for money. He was locked in a costly war with England, and his royal coffers were depleted. Crucially, Philip was heavily in debt to the Templars, having taken massive loans from their Paris temple. He saw the order's immense liquid wealth, gold, silver, and priceless relics, as the ultimate solution to all his financial woes, a prize too tempting to ignore. But Philip could not simply seize the property of the Church. He needed a moral and legal pretext, a justification that would turn the tide of public opinion against an order that was still widely revered. The order needed to be framed as heretics, criminals, and enemies of the state. Rumours of their secret, late-night initiation rituals were carefully amplified and distorted by the king's agents. The stage was set for one of history's most shocking acts of political conspiracy. On Friday, October 13th, 1307, King Philip IV executed a perfectly coordinated, unprecedented military operation. Across France, his agents simultaneously raided every Templar house and stronghold, seizing their property and arresting every knight. This coordinated action demonstrated the Templars' vulnerability and the king's terrifying reach across his kingdom. The date has since lived in infamy, forever associated with bad luck and betrayal. The charges filed against the knights were sensational, grotesque, and clearly fabricated: heresy, sodomy, and blasphemy. Specifically, they were accused of spitting on the cross during secret initiation ceremonies, engaging in immoral acts, and worshipping a bizarre pagan idol named Baphomet. These charges were designed not to uncover the truth, but to incite absolute public outrage and ensure that the Church, desperate to maintain its spiritual authority, would be forced to condemn them. The Templar Knights were accused of terrible crimes in order to dismantle the order and steal its riches. The arrests were immediately followed by a systematic, brutal campaign of torture sanctioned by the king's inquisitors. Using methods ranging from the rack to the slow burning of their feet, the inquisitors relentlessly sought confessions. Overwhelmed by agony, hundreds of knights, including senior officials, retracted their vows and signed documents confirming the manufactured charges of heresy and immoral behaviour. This provided King Philip with all the political ammunition he needed to dissolve the order and claim their vast wealth. Their initial dedication to fighting to the last man was finally broken by sustained, agonizing torture. The ultimate fate of the order rested on the defiance of their leader, Grand Master Jacques de Molay. After 7 years of horrific imprisonment, facing a papal tribunal on the Île aux Juifs in Paris, de Molay was brought forth to publicly confirm his confession and accept the dissolution of his order. Instead, he shocked the crowd and defied the king. In a moment of supreme, courageous rebellion, he retracted his earlier coerced statement, declaring that the charges were lies, and that the rule of the Templars was holy and just. The king's reaction was immediate and decisive. De Molay and another senior official, Geoffroy de Charnay, were instantly declared relapsed heretics. They were sentenced to be burned alive at the stake. On March 18, 1314, as the flames consumed him, Jacques de Molay was defiant to the last. According to a widely accepted legend, even as the fire roared, he shouted a terrifying curse upon those who had betrayed and murdered the innocent order. He summoned both King Philip IV and Pope Clement V to appear before the judgment of God within the year. This chilling, rapid fulfillment of the curse only cemented the Templars' legend and reinforced the powerful mystical aura surrounding the order. Within less than a year, both the king and the pope were dead. Pope Clement V died the following month from illness. King Philip IV died in a hunting accident later that same year. The organisation itself was officially dissolved by papal decree. Their remaining assets were transferred, mostly in name only, to the rival Knights Hospitaller. But one mystery remained central to the Templar legend: the Templar treasure. When the king's agents seized the Paris temple, the legendary hoard of gold, silver and relics was notably absent. The Templar fleet, their mighty navy, also vanished from the French coast? Did they sail to Scotland, Portugal, or perhaps even across the Atlantic, carrying the true sacred treasure with them? The disappearance of this treasure has inspired centuries of treasure hunts. The Templars' legacy did not die on the pyre. In the centuries that followed, they inspired endless fascination and speculation. Artists, writers, and secret societies wove elaborate tales of their supposed secrets. They are believed by some to have influenced the later founding of Freemasonry and other esoteric orders. In more recent times, popular culture and books like the Da Vinci Code have reimagined them as keepers of sacred knowledge that could shake the foundations of Christianity itself. Whether heretics or heroes, whether victims of conspiracy or justly punished for secret crimes, their legacy endures as one of history's greatest mysteries. They remain, even in death, the ultimate enigma of the medieval world, symbols of hidden wisdom, lost treasure, and the fatal clash between spiritual devotion and worldly power. They rose to powerful heights and fell quickly, victims of their own success, their accumulated wealth, and the changing political landscape of their time. The knights themselves, those monks on horseback, live on in stone carvings and ancient manuscripts, in whispered legends and scholarly debates, in the imagination of all those who seek to uncover the truth behind the Templar Code. In this video, we've explored the life, death, and enduring mystery of the Knights Templar, the pop monks on horseback, who redefined wealth, warfare, and religious power. But the story of history's great secret societies doesn't end with the smoke of de Molay's pyre. There are countless other tales of hidden knowledge, vanished treasures, and the clash between faith and power still waiting to be uncovered. If you found this deep dive into the Templars' paradox, from humble beginnings in chainmail to the architects of international finance, as compelling as we did, don't let the journey stop here. Your support is crucial to bringing these epic, untold histories to life. If you want more content that digs beneath the surface, revealing the truth behind the legends, hit the like button, share this video with fellow history enthusiasts, and, most importantly, please subscribe. Thanks again for watching. We'll see you in the next one.